Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Out here, under the vast and lonely sky, a man's heart can be a dangerous country, full of unmarked trails and hidden canyons of grief. Tonight's story is about a man who lost a love he thought had abandoned him, only to discover she was a prisoner in a hell he could barely imagine. It's a tale of a desperate vow, a journey into the teeth of the deadly desert, and a love that refused to die. So gather round for the story of a lonely cattleman and the ghost he chased across the sun-scorched plains, a tale we call the Coyote Flats Vow. The wind in the Texas Panhandle was a lonely, mournful thing. It was a constant, restless presence, the only companion to the solitary man who scratched a living from its vast and forgiving landscape. For Eli McRae, the wind was the soundtrack of his life, a low, keening song of all that he had lost. He was a cattleman, a drifter, a man whose only home was the back of his horse, his only family the memory of a love that had been scattered to that same relentless wind. He was a man carved from the land itself, lean and weathered, his face a roadmap of sun and sorrow, his eyes the color of a faded blue sky. He was a man of few words, his silence a deep well of a grief he never spoke of. But in the quiet, lonely hours of the night, as he sat by a small, flickering campfire, the ghost would always return to him. Her name was Isabel de la Cruz. She was the daughter of the wealthiest and most powerful rancher in the territory, the patron of the sprawling Rancho de la Luna. Eli had been just a common hand on her father's ranch, a man with nothing to his name but a good horse and a skill with a rope. She was a world away from him, a creature of silk dresses and quiet, shaded verandas. But love, in the West, pays no mind to class or station. Their love had been a secret, stolen thing, a series of whispered conversations in the cool of the stables, of hands that brushed against each other in the moonlight, of a single perfect and chaste kiss in the shadow of a cottonwood tree. It was a hopeless, impossible love, and they had both known it. Her father had other plans for her, a marriage to a wealthy cattle baron from the South, a union that would solidify his empire. And then she was gone. One morning, after a night of a ferocious, blinding dust storm, she had simply vanished. Her horse was gone, her finest dresses were gone. The official story, the one her stern, heartbroken father had told, was that she had run away, eloped with a traveling salesman, unable to face the arranged marriage that awaited her. She had chosen a life of comfort and ease over the dust and the duty of her home. The news had shattered Eli. It was not just the loss of her, but the betrayal. He had believed their love, as impossible as it was real. To think that she had simply cast it aside and run away without a word, without a goodbye. It had hollowed him out, leaving a cynical, bitter shell where a hopeful young man had once been. He had quit the ranch that very day and had been drifting ever since, a man running from a memory he could never escape. That had been 2 years ago. Now, he was just another face in a dusty, nameless border town, nursing a cheap whiskey, when a writer brought the news. The old patron, Don Miguel de la Cruz, was dead. He had been found in his study, a pistol in his hand, a single, self-inflicted wound to the head. The great ranch, the Rancho de la Luna, was now in the hands of the very man Isabel had been betrothed to, a cold, ruthless cattle baron named Ricardo Vargas. Something in the story didn't sit right with Eli. Don Miguel, for all his pride, was not a man who would take his own life. But it was not his business. The past was a closed book. He was preparing to ride out the next morning when a young, nervous vaquero from the Rancho de la Luna found him. The boy, a lad named Mateo whom Eli had once taught to rope, was pale and his eyes were wide with fear. "Sigor McRae," the boy stammered. "You must come. I have something for you. From the patron. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I was to find you and give you this." The boy handed him a worn, leather-bound saddlebag, one that had belonged to Don Miguel. Eli took it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He said you were the only one he could trust," Mateo whispered, his eyes darting nervously. "He said you were an honest man, and he was afraid. So very afraid. Now I must go, before Vargas's men see me." The boy mounted his horse and was gone, a phantom in the pre-dawn gloom. Eli took the saddlebag to the privacy of his cheap hotel room. Inside, he found a collection of his old boss's personal effects. And at the bottom, tucked into a hidden pocket, he found a letter. It was addressed to him. The handwriting was Don Miguel's, but it was shaky, frantic, the writing of a man at the end of his rope. "McCrae," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am dead, and the lies have finally won. I do not have much time. Vargas's men are watching me. They have taken my ranch, my land, and now they will take my life and call it a suicide. But there is a truth that must not die with me. It is a truth that concerns my daughter, my beautiful, lost Isabel. She did not run away. I lied to the world, to my own people, to save her, and in doing so, I have damned her. She was taken, McCrae, stolen from me in the night, during that terrible storm 2 years ago. It was not a kidnapping for ransom. It was a punishment. It was a message to me. Vargas, the man I was to have her marry, is not a cattleman. He is a monster, a man who deals in human flesh, in smuggling and in slavery across the border. I discovered his secret. I refused to let my daughter marry such a man. And for my defiance, he took her. He did not kill her. His cruelty is far more profound than that. He took her to a place from which no one returns. A place of legend and terror, a slave camp deep in the heart of the deadliest stretch of desert in this territory. A place they call the Coyote Flats. I have spent the last 2 years trying to get her back, using my wealth, my contacts. But Vargas is too powerful. He has thwarted my every move. And now he has come for me. My last hope, McCrae, is you. I know you loved her. And I know you are a man of honor, a man of your word. In this saddlebag, there is a map, and all the gold I have left. It is not much, but it is a start. I do not ask you to bring her back. I know that is an impossible task. I ask only that you see that justice is done, that you do what I was too weak, and too afraid, to do myself. Avenge my daughter. Avenge me. Let this be my final vow, passed from my dying hand to yours. Ali's world tilted on its axis. The letter fell from his trembling hands. The story of his life, the bedrock of his cynicism and his grief, had been a lie. Isabel had not betrayed him. She had been stolen, taken, and for 2 long years, she had been a prisoner in a hell he could not even imagine, while he had been cursing her name in dusty saloons. The grief, the guilt, and a new, terrible, all-consuming rage washed over him. He looked at his own reflection in the cracked mirror of the hotel room. He saw a hollowed-out man, a ghost who had been running from a memory. Now, that memory had a name. Coyote Flats. He took the rusted pistol from his holster. He took the faded, sweat-stained hat from the bedpost. And he took the vow from the hands of the dead man. He was no longer a drifter. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man with a singular, impossible purpose. He was going to walk into the deadliest desert in the territory, into a place from which no one returns, to find a ghost of his own, and to bring a righteous, bloody, and long overdue reckoning to the men who had taken her. The cattleman's lost love had just become his final, sacred mission. Coyote Flats was not a place on a map. It was a whispered legend, a ghost story told by old-timers to scare greenhorns. It was a vast, uncharted expanse of salt flats, shifting dunes, and sun-scorched, volcanic rock that lay in the deepest, most inaccessible part of the Sonora Desert. A place the Spanish had called El Espinazo del Diablo, Devil's Backbone. It was a place where the sun was a hammer, where the water was a lie, and where the only living things were the things that had learned to kill. To willingly ride into Coyote Flats was to be either a madman or a man with a death wish. Eli McCrae was both. He used the gold Don Miguel had left him to prepare. He did not buy a new gun or fancy gear. He bought knowledge. He spent a week in the border towns, in the smoky, back alley cantinas, listening to the whispers of smugglers and gunrunners. He learned that Coyote Flats was real, and that it was the heart of Ricardo Vargas's shadow empire, a place where stolen goods, illegal arms, and human cargo were traded. He learned that it was a fortress, protected by the desert itself and by a small, private army of Vargas's most ruthless killers. He also bought the best horse money could buy, a tough, desert-bred stallion with stamina in its bloodline and fire in its eyes. He packed light water jerky, ammunition, and the tools of his trade: a compass, a knife, and his well-worn lariat. His only guide was the crude, hand-drawn map left by Don Miguel, a map that was more a prayer than a set of directions. The journey began with a deceptive, almost beautiful ease. He rode south, out of the familiar, rolling plains of Texas and into the stark, alien beauty of the Sonoran landscape. The world became a place of towering saguaro cacti, their arms raised to the sky like silent, praying prophets, and of jagged, blood-red rock formations that had been carved by an eternity of wind. But as he rode deeper, following the map into the territory marked unexplored, the beauty began to reveal its underlying, malevolent teeth. The heat became a physical, oppressive presence, a weight on his shoulders that seemed to suck the very air from his lungs. The landscape became a monotonous, disorienting sea of sand and rock, a place where a man could lose his bearings and his mind in a matter of hours. He was a cattleman, a man of the plains. He knew the land, but this was a different kind of land. This was a place that actively tried to kill you. He had to learn a new language, the subtle, brutal language of the deep desert. He learned to read the signs of water in the flight of a bird, to navigate by the stars in a sky that was so clear and so vast it was terrifying. The desert was not just a physical challenge, it was a psychological one. The silence was absolute, a ringing in his ears that was broken only by the plodding of his horse and the sound of his own ragged breath. In that silence, his ghosts came to him. He was haunted by the memory of Isabel's face, her laughing eyes, her stolen kiss. But now, that beautiful memory was tainted by the horrifying images his mind conjured of what her life must have been for the past 2 years. The guilt was a constant, gnawing companion. He had been cursing her, while she had been enduring a living hell. The thought was a spur, driving him forward when exhaustion and despair threatened to consume him. The first human threat came on the 5th day. He was making camp in a small, rocky arroyo when he was ambushed by 2 men. They were not Vargas's men. They were Apaches, renegades, a small band that had refused to surrender and now lived as ghosts in the high desert, preying on anyone foolish enough to enter their territory. They were on him before he even knew they were there, to silent, bronze-skinned specters with knives and a deep, abiding hatred for the white men who had stolen their world. The fight was a desperate, primal, and brutal affair. Eli was a capable brawler, but these were warriors. He took a long, shallow cut along his ribs, the pain a hot, searing shock. But he was fighting with the strength of a man who had nothing left to lose, a man for whom death was not a fear, but a potential release. He managed to get to his pistol, and in the close, frantic struggle, he was forced to kill one of them. The other, seeing his brother fall, let out a cry of pure, agonized rage and came at him again. Eli did not fire. He could not bring himself to kill the other man. Instead, he met his charge, and in a desperate, bone-jarring tackle, he managed to subdue him, to get him in a hold that rendered him helpless. He lay there, panting, the hot, coppery smell of blood in his nostrils, the captured Apache warrior struggling beneath him. He could have killed him. It would have been the smart, safe thing to do. But as he looked into the man's eyes, he saw not a savage, but a man just like himself, a man who was fighting for a world that had been stolen from him. With a grunt of effort, he released the man and stood up, his pistol still in his hand, but pointed at the ground. He gestured to the dead warrior. "I am sorry for your brother," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "I did not come to this land seeking a fight." He then did something that went against every instinct of survival. He took one of his too precious canteens of water and tossed it to the Apache. He backed away slowly, his hands held open, a gesture of peace in a world that knew only war. The Apache warrior stared at him, his face a mask of confusion and a dawning, grudging respect. He picked up the canteen, and then, without a word, he gathered the body of his brother and disappeared back into the rocks, a silent, grieving ghost. Eli knew he had taken a terrible risk. The warrior could have come back in the night and slit his throat, but he had chosen mercy over survival, and in doing so, had honored a part of himself that he thought was long dead. He rode on, his side a constant, throbbing pain, his supplies now dangerously low. He had survived the desert's heat, and he had survived its native warriors. But he knew, with a grim certainty, that the worst was yet to come. He was approaching the heart of the devil's backbone, the place where the human predators, the ones who were far more dangerous than any snake or any Apache, made their lair. He was one man, wounded and alone, riding willingly into the gates of hell, his only guide a dead man's map, his only fuel a dying woman's promise. The landscape of the Coyote Flats was a vision of a dead world. The ground was a cracked, white pan of baked salt that stretched to the horizon, the heat shimmering off its surface in waves that distorted the air, making the world seem to melt and waver. The silence here was different, not the peaceful quiet of the high desert, but a dead, oppressive silence, as if the very air was too sick to move. It was a place that felt profoundly, fundamentally wrong. Allie's journey across the flats was a descent into a new level of hell. The reflected glare of the sun off the salt was blinding, and the heat was a physical, suffocating force. His horse, a creature of rock and sand, began to falter, its breath coming in ragged, labored bursts. Eli himself was running on pure, grim will. The wound in his side was a constant, throbbing fire, and he was beginning to be plagued by the cruel mirages of the desert, seeing phantom oases and distant, shimmering lakes that would vanish into thin air as he approached. He was also beginning to see her, Isabel. She would appear to him in the heat haze, a beautiful, smiling ghost, beckoning to him, her image a torment that was both a comfort and a curse. Was he going mad? Or was this just what the desert did, peeling away the layers of a man's sanity until only his deepest, most desperate desires remained? It was on the second day of his journey across the flats that he found the first sign of human life, and it was a grim one. He came across a line of wooden crosses, half buried in the shifting salt, a makeshift, anonymous graveyard. These were the graves of the slaves who had not survived the journey, a silent, stark testament to the brutality of Vargas's operation. And it was here that he had his first encounter with the human devils of this place. He was spotted by a patrol, two of Vargas's men, their forms dark, wavering specks in the distance that quickly resolved into two hard-faced riders. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The flats offered no cover. Eli dismounted, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. He lay on the hot, salt-crusted ground, using his dead horse which had finally, mercifully, collapsed as a barricade. He was a perfect, solitary target in a vast, white world. The two riders fanned out, their rifles barking, their bullets kicking up puffs of white salt around him. Eli did not fire wildly. He was a cattleman, not a soldier, but he was a superb marksman. He waited, his breathing slow and steady, ignoring the pain in his side. He waited until the riders, in their arrogance, drew closer. He fired once. The heavy report of his Winchester was a shocking, violent intrusion into the dead silence. One of the riders grunted and toppled from his saddle. The other, seeing his partner fall, reined in his horse, his arrogance instantly replaced by a cautious fear. He began to circle, looking for a better angle. The duel became a slow, deadly game of patience. It was a battle of one wounded, determined man against a circling predator. For what felt like an hour, they exchanged sporadic shots, neither able to gain a clear advantage. Eli knew that time was not on his side. He was losing blood, and his water was almost gone. He had to end this. He waited, his eye pressed to the rifle sight, his world shrunk to the small, circular view of the gun sight. He waited for his opponent to make a mistake. The mistake came. The rider, growing impatient, spurred his horse in a direct, reckless charge, hoping to overwhelm Eli with a volley of rapid shots. Eli took a deep, steadying breath. He led his target, just as he would lead a running deer, and he squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The rider cried out, his charge ending as he was thrown from his saddle. Eli had won. He was alive. But he was now a man on foot, in the middle of the deadliest desert in the territory, with a festering wound and a half-empty canteen. He scavenged what he could from the dead men, and their horses, water, ammunition, and a small pouch of dried meat. He chose the better of their two horses and continued his journey, a lone figure moving deeper into the white, silent hell of the Coyote Flats. He finally saw it at dusk on the third day. A dark smudge on the horizon that slowly resolved itself into a collection of crude, ugly buildings, shimmering in the heat haze. It was the slave camp, the heart of Vargas's evil empire. He did not ride in. He tethered his horse in a hidden crevice in the rocks a mile away and approached the camp on foot, crawling the last few hundred yards on his belly like a snake. The camp was a vision of human misery. It was a collection of rough, adobe huts, surrounded by a high fence of sharpened wooden stakes. He could see the prisoners, a collection of men, women, and even children, their faces gaunt, their bodies thin, their movements the slow, shuffling gait of people whose spirits had been broken. They were being worked in the salt mines, a brutal, killing labor under the watchful eyes of a dozen armed guards. He lay there until darkness fell, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest. The scope of Vargas's evil was greater than he had even imagined. How could one person survive in this place for 2 years? How could Isabel, his beautiful, gentle Isabel, have endured this? He scanned the faces of the prisoners, his heart filled with a terrible, desperate hope. He did not see her. As the night wore on, a new, more horrifying aspect of the camp was revealed. A few of the women prisoners were dragged from their huts and taken to a larger building, the guards' barracks, their muffled sobs a terrible counterpoint to the drunken, jeering laughter from within. The rage that filled Eli was so pure, so absolute, that it was a physical force. He was no longer just a man on a rescue mission. He was an avenger, a righteous, cleansing fire. He would not just rescue Isabel. He would burn this place to the ground and salt the earth where it had stood. He was about to make a desperate, suicidal move, to charge into the camp and die in a blaze of hopeless, avenging glory. But then, he saw something that froze him in place. A woman emerged from the barracks. She was not one of the weeping, terrified prisoners. She moved with a cold, hard, and terrifying purpose. She carried a tray of drinks, but her eyes were not the downcast, submissive eyes of a slave. They were hard, watchful, and filled with a light that looked chillingly like a banked, murderous fire. Her hair was cut short, and her face was thinner, harder, but there was no mistaking her. It was Isabel. But it was not that Isabel he remembered. The gentle, laughing girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had been forged in the fires of hell, a survivor who had learned to wear a mask of submission while nurturing a core of pure and yielding steel. She was alive, and she was a stranger. Eli lay in the darkness, his world once again turned on its axis. He had come here to rescue a princess from a dragon's lair. But he saw now that the princess had, in her own terrible way, learned to become a dragon herself. His mission had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. For 2 days, Eli remained a ghost in the rocks, a silent and seen observer of the hell that was the Coyote Flats slave camp. He watched Isabel, and with each passing hour, his eye and his horror grew in equal measure. The Isabel he had known, the girl of gentle laughter and stolen kisses, was a distant, faded memory. The woman who moved through the camp was a creature of ice and shadow, a master of a deadly, two-faced performance. He saw the way she served Vargas and his men, her face a mask of quiet, deferential obedience, her movements graceful and submissive. She was their trusted servant, the beautiful, broken plaything who had, over 2 long years, seemingly accepted her fate. They spoke freely in front of her, their guard down, seeing her as little more than a piece of furniture. But Eli saw what they did not. He saw the fleeting, reptilian coldness that would enter her eyes when their backs were turned. He saw the way she would subtly, almost invisibly, comfort a weeping child or slip a piece of stolen bread to a starving old man. He saw the way she watched everything, her gaze constantly moving, absorbing every detail of the camp, number of guards, their patrol schedules, the location of the armory. She was not a broken slave. She was a spy, a saboteur, a silent, one-woman insurgency, waiting for her moment. He realized, with a chill, that his sudden appearance could be as much of a danger to her as a salvation. To charge in, guns blazing, would be to destroy whatever long, patient game she was playing. He had to make contact, to let her know he was here, that she was no longer alone. His opportunity came on the 3rd night. He had observed that Isabel was the one who would take the camp's garbage, a collection of food scraps, and refuse and dump it in a deep pit a few dozen yards outside the main gate. It was a demeaning task, and she was always escorted by a single, board guard. That night, Eli was waiting. He was hidden in a shallow depression near the pit, covered with a layer of salt-crusted sand. As Isabel and the guard approached, he made his move. He did not use a gun. He rose from the ground like a ghost, and before the guard could even cry out, Ellie's arm was around his throat, cutting off his air. The struggle was brief and silent. Eli choked the man into unconsciousness and dragged him into the depression. Isabel stood frozen, the bucket dropped from her hands, her face a mask of shocked, utter disbelief. She stared at the gaunt, bearded, and scarred man before her, and in his faded, sky-blue eyes, she saw a ghost from a world she thought she had lost forever. "Eli," she whispered, the name a sound of both hope and a terrible, heart-wrenching pain. "I'm here," he said, his own voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "I know. I read your father's letter. I'm so sorry, Isabel. You thought I ran away," she finished for him, her voice flat, devoid of accusation. It was simply a statement of fact. A bitter, ironic smile touched her lips. "Everyone did. It was the last, kindest lie my father ever told." They stood there for a long moment, two ghosts from a dead past, reunited in the heart of a living nightmare. The chasm of 2 years, of his ignorance and her suffering, lay between them. "I've come to get you out of here," he said finally. "No," she said, and her voice was no longer the soft, gentle voice he remembered. It was hard, cold, and filled with a terrifying, absolute authority. "You are not getting me out of here. We are getting us out of here. And we are not just going to run. We are going to burn this place to the ground and kill every last one of them." She then, in a low, urgent whisper, laid out the plan she had been formulating for 2 long years. It was a plan of such audacious, brilliant, and ruthless violence that it took Ellie's breath away. She had identified the camp's weaknesses. She had cultivated allies among the most trusted slaves. She knew the location of the dynamite used for the salt mining. She had a timetable, a strategy, a complete blueprint for a slave rebellion. All she had been missing was a catalyst, a spark. And he, Eli McRae, was that spark. "Vargas and most of his men are riding out into days," she explained. "They're meeting a shipment. He'll leave only a skeleton crew of 12 men to guard the camp. That's when we strike." Her plan was a 3-pronged assault. She had arranged for the camp's food to be drugged with a powerful, sleep-inducing herb, a secret taught to her by an old Indian woman in the camp. While the guards were groggy and disoriented, she and a small, trusted team of slaves would raid the armory. At the same time, another team would secure the dynamite. And Eli, the ghost in the rocks, the legendary gunman, would be the signal, the match that would light the fire. "At midnight, 2 days from now," she said, her eyes burning with a cold, feverish light, "you will open fire on the main watchtower. It will be the signal for the rebellion to begin. We will arm the slaves, we will set the fires, and we will turn this desert into their grave." Eli looked at her, at this woman who had been transformed by her suffering into a brilliant, ruthless general. The dragon's fury, which she had kept hidden for 2 long years, was about to be unleashed. He was no longer her savior. He was now a soldier in her army. He gave a single, grim nod. "I'll be there," he said. He slipped back into the darkness, leaving her to return to the camp, to her role as the meek, obedient slave. As he made his way back to his hiding place, Eli felt a profound and unsettling shift in his own soul. He had come here, fueled by a vow of vengeance for a lost love. But now, he was a part of something larger. This was no longer just about rescuing Isabel. This was about liberating the damned. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the battle to come would not just be a fight for their lives, but a fight for what was left of their own humanity. The next 2 days were an exercise in a kind of silent, screaming tension that was more agonizing than any physical pain. For Eli, hidden in his rocky perch, it was a test of his patience and his nerve. He could see the camp, could see Isabel moving through it, playing her part as the meek, subservient slave, and every moment was a torment. He had to fight the primal, overwhelming urge to simply charge in, guns blazing, to end the waiting. But he trusted her. He trusted her plan. And so he waited, a cold spring of potential violence, his world shrunk to the view through his rifle sights. For Isabel, the last 48 hours of her 2-year captivity were a razor's edge of hope and terror. Every smile she forced, every deferential nod she gave to her captors, was a performance that required every last ounce of her self-control. She was a conspirator, general on the eve of a battle, and a single misplaced word, a single flicker of the cold fury in her eyes, could betray everything and condemn them all to a horrific death. She moved through the camp, activating her small, secret network of rebels. Her second-in-command was an old, grizzled slave named Marcus, a man whose family had been killed by Vargas and whose quiet, burning hatred was as deep and as pure as her own. She gave him his final instructions in a series of whispered, coded conversations. He would lead the team to secure the dynamite. Her other key ally was a young, weary woman named Elena, whose job in the kitchens gave her access to the camp's food and water. It would be Elena's task to administer the sleeping drought, a dangerous, all-or-nothing gambit that was the linchpin of the entire plan. On the morning of the appointed day, Ricardo Vargas and the bulk of his men, a force of some 20 riders, rode out of the camp. As Isabel had predicted, they were arrogant and confident, leaving behind a skeleton crew of 12 guards under the command of a particularly sadistic lieutenant named Rojas. Rojas was a man who enjoyed his work, and he immediately set about making the lives of the remaining prisoners a living hell, as if to compensate for his own bitterness at being left behind. The day was an eternity of small, near disasters. One of the guards, complaining of a sour stomach, refused to eat the midday meal, narrowly avoiding the first, smaller dose of the sleeping herb Elena had mixed into the stew. Rojas, in a fit of pique, decided to conduct a surprise inspection of the prisoners' huts, and nearly discovered the small cache of makeshift weapon-sharpened pieces of scrap metal, heavy wooden clubs that Marcus had hidden. But they survived. They held their nerve. As dusk began to fall, a tense, electric anticipation settled over the camp. The final meal was served. Elena, her hands trembling but her face a mask of calm, served the guards their stew and their coffee, now laced with a heavy, final dose of the sleeping drought. Isabel watched, her heart in her throat, as the guards ate and drank. One of them complained that the coffee tasted bitter, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought the plan was discovered. But Rojas, annoyed, simply told the man to shut up and drink it. An hour passed. Then too. The drug was slow-acting, designed to mimic a natural, drunken stupor. Slowly, one by one, the guards began to succumb. Their movements became sluggish, their speech slurred. Rojas, a man with a formidable constitution, was the last to fall, but eventually, he just slumped over the table in the main barracks, dead to the world. The moment had come. With a silent signal, Isabel, Marcus, Elena, and a half-dozen of their most trusted rebels slipped from their huts. The camp was eerily quiet, the only sounds the low moan of the wind and the heavy, snoring breath of their drugged captors. The rebellion began not with a bang, but with a series of silent, brutal acts of vengeance. They moved from guard to guard, not just the ones in the barracks, but the few who had been on patrol and had staggered back to their posts before collapsing. They did not wake them. They slit their throats, a swift, merciless, and silent accounting for 2 years of torment. Isabel, her face a hard, motionless mask, led her team to the armory. It was a small, heavily barred adobe hut. Using a set of keys she had managed to make a wax impression of weeks before, she opened the lock. Inside, the racks of rifles and boxes of ammunition were a beautiful, terrifying sight. They began to arm the slaves. Marcus and his team, meanwhile, made their way to the small, isolated shed where the dynamite was stored. They worked quickly, carrying the heavy and stable crates out into the center of the camp. The slaves, 100 strong, were now gathering in the center of the camp. They were no longer a shuffling, broken herd. The sight of their dead captors, and the feel of a rifle in their own hands, had transformed them. Their eyes, once dull with despair, now burned with a new, wild, and hungry light. Isabel stood before them, a pistol in her hand, her slight frame seeming to possess a giant's authority in the moonlight. She did not give a long speech. She did not need to. "Tonight," she said, her voice ringing with a cold, clear power, "we take back our lives. There will be no mercy. There will be no prisoners. Remember your chains. Remember your dead." She turned her gaze to the high, wooden watchtower at the camp's main entrance, the symbol of their long imprisonment. She looked out into the darkness, toward the rocks where she knew Lai was waiting. "Now," she screamed, her voice a raw, primal cry of rage and liberation. And from the darkness, a mile away, a single rifle shot answered her, a flash of orange fire, a declaration of war. Ellie's bullet, impossibly accurate in the dark, slammed into the oil lamp at the top of the watchtower. The lamp shattered, and the top of the tower erupted in a ball of flame. It was the signal. The rebellion exploded. Marcus and his men began to strategically place the dynamite charges around the camp's main buildings. The newly armed slaves, their fear burned away by a white-hot rage, began their terrible, righteous work. The longest night of their lives was over. The night of their vengeance had just begun. The battle for the Coyote Flats slave camp was not a battle. It was a cleansing. It was a raw, primal, and terrifying explosion of pent-up fury, a human dam of misery and oppression bursting forth in a single, unstoppable flood of violence. With the watchtower as their beacon, their armed slaves, led by Isabel, swarmed through the camp. They were no longer victims. They were a righteous, avenging army. They showed no mercy to the few guards who had managed to resist the effects of the drug, cutting them down with a brutal efficiency born of 2 years of suppressed rage. Eli, from his position in the rocks, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and a deep, chilling horror. He saw the camp, which had been a place of silent misery, transformed into a vision of hell. The small, crude huts of the prisoners were set ablaze, not by their captors, but by the prisoners themselves, a symbolic act of destroying their own cages. The flames, whipped by the desert wind, cast a flickering, demonic light on the scene, turning the celebrating, screaming figures into silhouettes in a terrible, ritualistic dance. His role as the signalman was over. He was a gunman, a fighter, and his place was in the heart of the battle. He made his way down from the rocks and, using the chaos as his cover, he slipped through the main gate. He was no longer a rescuer. He was a soldier in Isabel's army, a fact that was both profoundly unsettling and strangely, exhilaratingly right. He found her in the center of the camp, near the now raging bonfire that had once been the main barracks. She was not the wild, screaming figure of a blood-crazed revolutionary. She was a calm, cold, and efficient commander in the heart of a hurricane. She moved through the chaos, giving orders, directing her small, impromptu army with a natural, instinctive authority. "Marcus," she yelled, her voice cutting through the din. "The west wall. Take the dynamite there. We need to blow a hole in the fence, create an escape route before Vargas gets back." She saw Eli, and a flicker of something gruff, acknowledgement, crossed her face. There was no time for words. She simply tossed him a spare rifle she was carrying. "The east gate," she commanded. "Vargas will come from that direction. Hold them off as long as you can. Buy us time." It was a suicide mission, and they both knew it. But Eli simply nodded, a grim smile on his face. He had come here to die for her, if need be, to be given a chance to die with her, fighting for a cause that was now as much his as it was hers, was a fate he accepted without question. He gathered a small group of the bravest of the newly armed slaves and made his way to the eastern perimeter of the camp. They took up positions behind the flimsy cover of the adobe huts, their eyes fixed on the dark, empty horizon. They did not have to wait long. Ricardo Vargas, alerted to the rebellion by the massive glow of the fires in the sky, was returning, and he was returning with a vengeance. The sound of a dozen riders, approaching at a full, furious gallop, was a low, growing thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. "Hold your fire until you see their faces," Eli roared at the terrified but resolute men beside him. Vargas and his men charged out of the darkness, a wave of dark, demonic figures, their guns blazing. The battle for the East Gate began. It was a desperate, one-sided affair. Eli and his small band of untrained ex-slaves were no match for Vargas's professional killers. But they fought with the courage of men and women who had already been to hell and were not afraid to die. Eli was a rock in the storm. He fought with a cold, deadly precision, his rifle a steady, arcing presence. He was not just fighting for Isabel, for his vow. He was fighting for these people, for their single precious and hard-won night of freedom. But they were being overwhelmed. Their numbers were dwindling, their ammunition running low. Vargas and his men were pushing forward, step by bloody step. And then, just as all seemed lost, the world erupted. A series of massive, coordinated explosions tore through the western side of the camp. Marcus had completed his task. The dynamite, placed with a miner's expert knowledge, did not just blow a hole in the fence. It triggered a massive rock slide from the cliffs that overlooked the camp, sending tons of rock and earth cascading down, not only creating an escape route, but also crushing a half-dozen of Vargas's men who had been trying to circle around. The tide of the battle turned in an instant. The surviving slaves, their escape route now clear, began to pour through the gap in the fence, a river of humanity fleeing into the dark, protective arms of the desert. And from the heart of the camp, a new, terrifying figure of vengeance emerged. Isabel, her face a mask of smoke and fury, a pistol in each hand, was leading a small, desperate, rearguard action, covering the retreat of her people. She was a Valkyria, a goddess of war, her guns spitting fire into the ranks of the stunned and disorganized outlaws. Eli and his few remaining fighters saw their chance. They abandoned their defensive positions and charged, a final, desperate, banzai-like assault, adding their guns to the chaos, buying a few more precious seconds for the slaves to escape. In the fiery, smoke-filled heart of the dying camp, the two lovers, the Cattleman and the Dragon, were united, fighting back-to-back, a two-person army against the remnants of a shattered empire. They were outnumbered, but they were fighting with a power that Vargas and his men could not understand, the power of a love that had been forged in loss and a vow that had been sanctified in blood and fire. The desert had never seen a fire like this, and the dawn, if they lived to see it, would rise on a world that had been forever changed by its flames. The heart of the burning camp became the final, bloody stage for a story that had begun with a stolen kiss. Eli and Isabel, reunited in a crucible of fire and gunpowder, were a terrifying, almost supernatural force. They were two distinct fighters who moved with a single, shared purpose, their movements weaving around each other in a deadly, instinctive dance. Eli was the anchor, the rock. He fought with a cattleman's steady, implacable strength, his rifle a brutal, efficient tool. He would lay down a withering field of fire, forcing Vargas's men to take cover, his presence a solid, unmovable wall of defiance. Isabel was the fire, the fury. She was a dervish of controlled, vengeful rage, her two pistols a constant, barking counterpoint to the deep boom of Ellie's rifle. She did not fight from a static position. She was a blur of motion, using the chaos, the smoke, and the flickering shadows as her allies, appearing from behind a burning wagon to fire a devastating volley, then disappearing again before her enemies could draw a bead on her. She was fighting with 2 years of suppressed hatred, and every shot was a release, an exorcism of the demons that had haunted her in the long, dark nights of her captivity. Ricardo Vargas, watching his men being cut down by this two-person army, was a man undone. The woman he had seen as a broken, beautiful plaything had become a goddess of vengeance, and the ghost of a simple farmer he had never even considered a threat was now the hammer of her wrath. His empire of salt and suffering was being dismantled before his eyes by the two people whose lives he had so casually destroyed. "Kill them!" he roared at his few remaining men, his voice a raw, desperate shriek. "Kill them both!" But his men were broken. They were caught between the two avengers in front of them and the growing, triumphant roar of the escaped slaves, who had now armed themselves with rocks and clubs and were beginning to surge back from the desert, a wave of righteous fury. The hunters had become the hunted, and their nerve was gone. They began to flee, melting into the darkness, abandoning their leader to his fate. Now, only 3 figures remained in the fiery clearing: Eli, Isabel, and Ricardo Vargas. Vargas, a cornered, rabid animal, made his final, desperate move. He did not charge. He turned and ran, scrambling over the rubble toward the one place of perceived safety, the small, stone-built powder magazine, where the camp's main supply of gunpowder was stored. "Isabel, no!" Eli yelled, seeing the look in her eyes, the final, suicidal purpose. But she was already in motion. She sprinted after him, her face a mask of pure, murderous intent. This was her kill. This was the final payment for her stolen life. Eli raced after her, knowing what Vargas was planning. A cornered rat will always try to bring the whole world down with it. Isabel was faster. She caught up to Vargas just as he reached the heavy, iron-bound door of the magazine. He turned, a wild, triumphant leer on his face, a lit match in his hand. "If I am to burn in hell," he hissed, "I will take you with me, my love." He threw the match into the open doorway. Isabel did not hesitate. She did not try to run. In that split, final second, she did not think of survival. She thought only of Eli. She turned and threw her body against his, a desperate, powerful shove that sent him stumbling backward, out of the immediate blast zone. "Live!" she screamed, the word a final, fierce command. And then the world exploded. The powder magazine erupted in a single, massive, concussive blast that was more a force of nature than an explosion. A blinding, white-hot flower of fire blossomed into the night sky, its roar a physical blow that threw Eli from his feet, the heat searing his back. The very ground shook, and the last of the camp's buildings were flattened as if by the hand of an angry god. Eli was thrown into a merciful darkness. He awoke to a world of ringing silence and pain. He was lying 20 yards from the epicenter of the blast, his body a symphony of agony, his back and arms peppered with burns and splinters. He pushed himself up, his mind a confused, muddy haze. The camp was gone. In its place was a massive, smoking crater. The fire, its fuel consumed in that single, apocalyptic instant, was already dying down, leaving only a glowing, hellish landscape of embers and ash. Isabel. His voice was a raw, broken croak. He stumbled through the ruins, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest. He had found her, only to lose her again. The terrible, bitter irony of it was a poison in his soul. He found her near the edge of the crater. She had been thrown by the blast, her small body a broken, twisted thing. He fell to his knees beside her, a terrible, animalistic sound of pure, undiluted grief tearing from his throat. She was alive, barely. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him. A faint, bloody smile touched her lips. Did we win?" she whispered, her voice a fragile, reedy thing. "We won," he said, his voice choked with tears he did not know he still had. He gathered her into his arms, as gently as if she were a piece of spun glass. "We won, Isabel." "Good," she sighed, her eyes closing. "I'm so tired." He held her there, in the ashes of their victory, as the first, pale, and indifferent fingers of dawn began to touch the eastern sky. He had come to the desert to fulfill a vow. He had found his lost love, and he had helped her to her victory. But now, he had to face the hardest battle of all, a desperate, hopeless race against the rising sun, to carry the flickering flame of her life out of the hell they had just survived. The journey out of the Coyote Flats was a desperate, agonizing pilgrimage. Eli was a man running a race against death itself, and his only prize was the faint, shallow breath of the woman in his arms. He found his horse, which had been driven to a panic by the explosion but had not fled far. He fashioned a crude travois from the charred timbers of a fallen watchtower and laid Isabel, wrapped in his own tattered shirt, as gently as he could upon it. Every step the horse took, every jolt and bump on the uneven, salt-crusted ground, was a fresh wave of agony for Isabel, and a fresh torment for Eli. He walked beside the horse, his own wound burns on his back, the deep, aching exhaustion a distant, irrelevant choir of pain. His entire world, his entire being, was focused on the fragile, broken woman he was pulling behind him. He was a man stripped of everything but a single, desperate purpose, to get her to a doctor, to a place of healing, to a world that was not made of ash and blood. He pushed them relentlessly, his own grief and fear a merciless spur. They were haunted by the ghosts of their victory. As they traveled, the escaped slaves, who had scattered into the desert, began to find them. They would appear, in small, silent groups, their faces a mixture of awe, reverence, and a deep, sorrowful gratitude. They did not have much, but they offered what they could: a mouthful of water from a hidden spring, a piece of dried meat, a poultice of dessert herbs for Ellie's burns. They were a silent honor guard, escorting their wounded queen and her loyal consort out of the ruins of their shared kingdom. They would travel with them for a time, ensuring their path was clear, and then they would melt back into the desert, on their way to their own new and certain lives in the free lands of Mexico. It was during this long, terrible journey that the walls between Eli and Isabel, the walls built of 2 years of silence and a week of shared violence, finally crumbled. During the brief, necessary rests, he would tend to her wounds, his rough, calloused cattleman's hands surprisingly gentle. He would talk to her, his voice a low, constant murmur, telling her stories of the life she had missed, of the small, simple things, trying to anchor her to the world of the living. And she, in her moments of lucidity between the waves of pain and fever, would talk to him. She told him of the 2 years in the camp, of the small acts of defiance, of the friendships forged in misery, of the slow, patient process of nurturing the cold seed of her rage into a plan for rebellion. She was not asking for pity. She was bearing witness, sharing the terrible weight of her experience, and in doing so, she was, for the first time, beginning to let it go. They were no longer the young, innocent lovers of the Rancho de la Luna. They were discarded, battle-weary veterans, and their love, which was being rekindled in this desperate flight, was not the bright, hopeful flame of their youth. It was a different kind of love, a deeper, quieter, and more resilient thing, a love that had been tested in the fires of hell and had not been consumed. It was a love built not on stolen kisses, but on shared survival. After 5 agonizing days, they finally reached the edge of the desert. They stumbled into a small, dusty, Mexican border town, two ragged, blood-stained apparitions who looked as if they had walked directly out of a grave. Eli, using the last of his strength, carried Isabel into the office of the town's only doctor, a kind, elderly man with sad eyes and steady hands. The doctor took one look at Isabel's broken body and at the fierce, desperate love in Ellie's eyes, and he went to work. For a week, Eli did not leave her side. He sat in a chair by her bed, a silent and movable guardian, as she hovered in the twilight world between life and death. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He simply watched, and he willed her to live. On the 7th day, her fever broke. She opened her eyes, and for the first time, he saw not the cold, hard fire of the dragon, but the clear, gentle light of the Isabel he had thought he had lost forever. Eli, she whispered, her voice weak, but her own. He took her hand, and his own tears, the ones he had held back for 2 long, terrible years, finally fell. The physical battle was over. The vow he had made to her dead father had been fulfilled. But as he sat there, holding the hand of the woman he had walked through hell to find, he knew that their journey was not over. They had survived the desert. They had survived the fire. Now, they had to face the hardest, most difficult journey of all, the long, quiet road of healing, a path they would have to walk together, one slow, painful, and hopeful step at a time. The small, dusty border town became their sanctuary, a quiet, anonymous place to heal the wounds that were more than skin deep. The doctor, a man who asked few questions and possessed a deep, weary wisdom, became their first friend in this new, fragile life. Eli, his own burns and cuts healing, took a job working in the town's livery stable. The simple, honest labor of working with horses was a balm to his soul, a connection to the gentle, peaceful man he had once been. Isabel's recovery was a slow, arduous process. Her body was broken, but her spirit, the core of unyielding steel that had allowed her to survive 2 years in a living hell, refused to be defeated. Eli was her constant, quiet presence. He would help her with the painful, difficult exercises the doctor prescribed. He would read to her in the long afternoons. He would simply sit with her on the porch of their small, rented adobe house, watching the world go by, their shared silence a more profound comfort than any words could have been. As her physical strength returned, the deeper, psychological scars of her ordeal began to surface. She was haunted by nightmares, her nights filled with the ghosts of the camp, her own screams waking her in a cold sweat. It was during these dark hours that the bond between them, forged in the crucible of their shared battle, was tempered into something new. Eli would hold her, his strong, steady presence an anchor in the storm of her memories. He did not offer empty platitudes. He simply held her, a silent, unwavering testament to the fact that she was no longer alone. And she, in turn, became the healer of his wounds. She saw the deep, abiding guilt he carried for the 2 years he had believed she had abandoned him. "It was not your fault, Eli," she told him one quiet evening, as they watched the sun set, painting the desert sky in hues of soft rose and gold. "My father's lie. It was an act of love. A desperate, foolish act, but it was meant to protect me. And you were a victim of that lie, just as I was. I should have known," he whispered, his voice thick with a self-recrimination he had carried for months. "I should have felt in my heart that you would never just leave. You were a boy heartbroken and betrayed," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "And I was a ghost. How can you blame yourself for not being able to hear a ghost's whisper?" In these quiet, honest conversations, they began to slowly, painstakingly, rebuild the bridge between their past and their future. They spoke of her father, of his courage and his tragic, protective lie. They spoke of the boy Eli had been and the girl she had been, 2 young, hopeful people who had been caught in the gears of a cruel and violent world. And in speaking of them, they were able to finally, and gently, Let them go. They were not the same people. The fire had changed them both, burned away the naive, youthful innocence they had once possessed. But the man and woman who had emerged from that fire were stronger, more resilient, and their love, which was slowly, quietly, being reborn, was a deeper and more profound thing. It was a love that was not built on dreams, but on the shared, hard-won reality of survival. They never spoke of the future, not in grand, declarative terms. Their future was being built in the small, quiet moments of their daily lives, in a shared meal, and a quiet walk at sunset, in the simple, profound comfort of a hand reached for and held in the darkness. After a year, when Isabel was strong enough to travel again, they knew it was time to leave. The border town had been a kind, gentle purgatory, but it was not a home. They bought a wagon and two sturdy mules. They had no real possessions, only the clothes on their backs and the small amount of money Eli had saved from his work. They were starting over, with nothing but each other. On the morning they were to leave, Mateo, the young vaquero from the Rancho de la Luna, the boy who had brought Eli the fateful letter, rode into town. He had spent the last year searching for them. He brought news. Ricardo Vargas, in the wake of the destruction of his slave camp, had been ruined. His empire, built on a foundation of terror and illegal trade, had collapsed. He had been killed a few months back, not by a lawman, but by one of his own betrayed partners in a dusty cantina in Mexico. The last ghost of their past had been laid to rest. Mateo also brought them a gift. It was a small, heavy pouch of gold coins, a reward that had been put up by the families of the slaves they had freed. "They call you legends on the border," Mateo said, his eyes shining with a hero's worship. "The angel and the avenger." Eli and Isabel looked at each other, a slow, sad smile passing between them. Legends. They were just two broken people who had managed to survive. They accepted the gold, not as a reward, but as a stake for their new life. They said their farewells to the doctor, and to the town that had been their sanctuary. And then, they turned their wagon north, not back toward the haunted lands of Texas, but toward the high green and unknown country of the far territories. They were no longer running from anything. They were simply, and finally, moving toward something. Together. The final chapter of the story of Eli and Isabel is not a tale of high drama or violent confrontation. It is a quiet story, a tale whose beauty lies in the simple and spoken truth of a life rebuilt from ashes. They found their home in a small, secluded valley in the high country of Colorado, a place of tall pines, clear, rushing streams, and a peace so profound it seemed to seep into their very bones. They used the ghost's gold to buy a small piece of land, and with their own two hands, they built a new life. Eli, the cattleman, found a deep, abiding joy in the simple, honest labor of being a farmer once more. He was a man who knew how to build, how to nurture, and in the act of turning the soil and raising a home, he began to slowly, and finally, heal himself. Isabel, the rancher's daughter who had become a warrior queen, found a new kind of strength, the strength of a healer. She became the valley's unofficial doctor and midwife. Her hands, which had once been forced to acts of terrible violence, now dedicated to bringing new life into the world and to tending to the sick. The haunted, hard look in her eyes was replaced by a deep, compassionate wisdom. They never married, not in the official sense. They had no need for a preacher's words or a legal document. They were bound by a vow that was deeper and more sacred than any of that, a vow that had been forged in the desert, sanctified in fire, and sealed in their shared survival. They were husband and wife in the only way that truly mattered. They were a quiet, respected, and somewhat mysterious couple, the McRaes who lived at the end of the valley. Their neighbors knew that they had come from a hard past. The evidence of it was there in the scars on Ellie's back and the occasional, distant, haunted look that would sometimes enter Isabel's eyes. But they were good people, good neighbors, and that was all that mattered. They had children, 2 sons and a daughter, children of the high, peaceful mountains, who grew up knowing only the love and the security of the home their parents had so carefully, and so consciously, built. Eli and Isabel never spoke to them of the Coyote Flats, of Vargas, or of the fire and the blood. That chapter of their lives was a book that they had closed and locked away. But they taught their children the lessons they had learned. They taught them to be strong, to be resilient, to be compassionate. They taught them to stand up for those who could not stand for themselves. And they taught them that the most sacred thing a person could possess was not land or money, but their own integrity. The ending of their story is a simple one. It is the image of an old man and an old woman, their hair now streaked with gray, sitting together on the porch of their small, sturdy cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in hues of gold and rose. They are holding hands, their fingers intertwined, a map of shared scars and a lifetime of unspoken love. The desert had kept its vow. It had taken everything from them, and in return, it had given them the one thing they had both been searching for, not just a life, but a peace that was as deep, as quiet, and as enduring as the mountains themselves. The love that had been lost in the dust had been found again, not in a grand, passionate reunion, but in the slow, patient, and beautiful work of building a life, a home, and a family, together.